Hey there and welcome to another TechHub.training solution video for the monthly Excel challenge entitled The Data Dentist. Let's jump in. So in this challenge, as the name suggests, you are working for a dental office doing cleaning, but in this case it's not dental cleaning, it's data cleaning. This is actually a job that I held for quite a long time. I would get every month bank statements and credit card statements downloaded from offline, and for some reason a lot of banks still like to put them in a really pretty format that doesn't translate very well to Excel. So as you see here, there's a Chase bank statement that includes a date, line item, detail, amount. Same thing goes for American Express statements and Visa statements. Now they don't actually look like this, but this was just designed to give you some idea of something you could see. So if you notice, there are different spaces here for columns, different column widths, different row widths. Some of these have, you'll notice, this block consists of 4 columns, whereas this block consists of 6. So it's not very clean, and you've been tasked with putting all that data into this tab, extracting the date and amount, and from that line item detail of vendor, associating that with an account and an account number, using this other page of approved vendors, and finally linking it to the office. So let's jump in. I personally used VBA for this solution. I kind of wrote this challenge with the idea that people would use VBA. I know some people have been using Excel formulas, which I think that's great. That's a little bit beyond my personal knowledge of Excel formulas. But if you can do it that way, that's great. I personally use VBA. And let's jump in. You're going to want to go to the Developer tab, open the Visual Basic window, and you get this nice 1990s-esque looking IDE. You're going to insert a module. And I actually wrote the code already. We're not going to walk through it. I'm just going to select the code that I wrote, copy it, and we're going to paste it in here. So let's go ahead and walk through what this code says. So I'm sure a lot of people used 3 different scripts because there are 3 different types of statements. There's a bank statement, an American Express statement, and a Visa statement. I personally decided to put it into just one sub-procedure that can clean all of them. So first thing I did is I declared my variables. Fecha, it means date in Spanish. Date is a reserved word, so you can't use it to declare a variable. So I declared a date, an amount, a vendor, and an office. And then these are just some housekeeping variables. Sheet count and row are both used as variables, incrementers within loops. And then transaction is another variable that I included as an incrementer variable to get the line within transaction report of the new transaction we're printing. And this variable last row I wrote some code that will go through and find in each page the last active cell so that we don't loop through too much. For instance, in this case on this bank statement sheet, it'd be 1393. So I used arrays extensively. If you don't know arrays, aren't familiar with them in VBA, they are familiar, or they are similar to anything you would see in almost any other language like Python or JavaScript. The difference is an array in this case is not a variable type, it's just a list basically of variables. So the first thing I did was save these offices into an array of offices, each named Salt Lake office, Denver office, San Francisco office, Seattle office. The next thing I did in this whole block, for each type of statement, the Chase statement, the Amex statement, and the Visa statement, I decided that I was going to find the column number. C would correspond to 3 in this case. E would correspond to 5. H would correspond to 8. I saved in those column numbers and the offset from the top of this block for the date, vendor, and amount. So in other words, let's look, we're on an American Express statement here, so let's look at this block of code. This is an array that consists of 3 columns, 2 rows. The first column has a value of 8, and that's for date. So in other words, the date here is housed in the 8th column over. This first column, second row is equal to 1. In other words, from the top of this block, when you run into this amount, what is the offset from that row? It's, in this case, offset by just 1 below. Looking at the vendor is in the 5th column, in other words, column E, and it is offset by 0. It's on the same row as this first bit of information on this transaction. And following that logic, the amount in this case is on column 3 or column C, offset by 0. I did that for the bank statement, the American Express statement, the Visa statements, and I saved those into arrays entitled bank statement, Amex card, Visa card. So what that will do for us is when looping through, you'll be able to find if this column has any information in it on the row that we're currently on in this iteration, then I want you to extract the date from the column number and offset, respectively, for the date, the vendor, and the amount. The next thing I did was I created an array of the sheet names, just these basic names here, so that I could iterate sheet to sheet in a single loop, be able to do each of these 5 sheets. And the statement type, which I pulled in this array. So if you see bank statement, what type is it? Well, it's a bank statement. This array specifically has 5 columns, 1 for each of the sheets, and 2 rows. The first row will tell you the name of the sheet. The second row will contain the corresponding array that has all the information for row and column offsets necessary to pull the data from the right places. So I did that for each of these cards and statements. And now we have a lot of arrays going. We have an array containing other arrays that will help us be able to loop through. So we're going to loop through first this array and pull all the information in from all these other arrays within it. So the next thing I did is, this is just a simple assignment. The transaction variable, the transaction report, starts, the first open line is line 2. So we're going to initialize that. And then we're going to start looping. The first loop counts through each sheet. 0 to 4, that's inclusive. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, we're going to loop through 5 times. First thing I want to do, we're going to start, the first loop through will be on this bank statement. So we're going to find the last row, which remember was 1393, I believe. We're going to then loop through from the top row, the first row that can possibly have data in the sheet, to the very last row in each of the 5 statements. Now, fortunately, the first row containing data in all of these happens to be row 6. There's row 6 there. If we go up here, there's row 6 there, and same thing with Visa row 6. So that adds some simplicity. You don't have to make that variable dynamic. But we're going to loop through, and the first thing we're going to do is, we don't want to, really it's the Visa statements that throw us off, because you can't have a set step, because the offset from this first transaction, this second transaction is going to be 6, and this next one's going to be 6, but this one's only going to be 4. So you can't do a set step. But what I did instead is it's going to take a little bit longer through the code, but just so I could put it in one script that works for all 3 types of statements, I'm just looping through each row from the 6th row down to the last row with data in it in the sheet. And the first thing it says is, okay, does this cell have any information in it? And that's the row that we're looping through, and the column is specifically right here, which it will be the first in this bank statement array. It's going to be position 002, so column 2 or column B. So as we loop through each time, it's going to pull that very first value from that array for the bank statement, Amex card, and Visa cards. It's going to loop through every row in that specific column that we just looked at for each statement. And if it's not empty, then we're going to do all of this stuff. We're going to extract all the information. So the first thing we'll get to on row 6, it sees this isn't empty. First, I'm going to save the date, which, remember, I'm pulling in the row and column offsets from those arrays, saving into that date variable. And then for Visa transactions, if this is a Visa card, which, remember, if you see the data dictionary, you see cards ending in 6738 and 5480 are both Visa cards. Then what I went ahead and did is I added 2022 to the Visa card because you see it only has the month and day. So that's all we need to do for the date. It's saved into that variable. The next thing, vendor's pretty easy for now. We're just going to save that line item detail again using those row and column offsets from the arrays I created. Save that entire line item as a vendor. We're going to have to eventually extract that vendor name out of that row, but for now we have it saved. So that's actually the next step we'll do. If it's a bank statement, then in bank statement format we have a date and then the name of the vendor and then an office ID. So we're going to first save the office ID. We're going to need that later to fill in that office column in the transaction report. We're going to use the write function built into VBA. We're going to pull the rightmost 8 digits off of that and save that into the office. Then we're going to go ahead and save vendor, and we're going to replace whatever's on the left and right in order to get the name of the vendor that we need. So that's going to take care of the bank statements. If it's not a bank statement, but it is a Visa card, then we're going to go ahead and split that vendor on that dash, and we're going to take whatever's left of it. It's going to take the dash and the space, so we're just left with the name of the vendor. And then finally, if it's not a bank statement, it's not a Visa statement, it's got to be an Amex statement, we're going to go ahead and extract the vendor in the same way. In this case, it has a unique ID made up of a 4-letter ID, a dash, and the date. We're going to cut all that off, and that's just going to leave us the vendor. So that saves the vendor. Now the amount is pretty easy comparatively. The amount is the same in all three, so we're just going to, using those row and column offsets from those arrays, save that into the amount. So now that we have those 3 bits of information, we're going to put them into the new line that we're on. Transaction, remember, is that right now, if we're in the first iteration, be line 2. If it's in the second iteration, it'll be line 3, etc. We're going to dump in the date, the amount, and the cleaned vendor that we have. Finally, after that, if the sheet count is greater than 0, so what that does is the first sheet that we're going to iterate through, or sheet 0 in this case, because VBA uses 0 indexing, that first sheet is the bank statement. So what we're saying is if it's not a bank statement, then column 6, the office, is going to be equal to the offices in sheet count -1. So we see here there's this list of offices. The first office is Salt Lake City, and then Denver, then San Francisco, then Seattle. And fortunately, the names of these sheets correspond to these offices. So we're just going to loop through in order. And basically what that just says is we're going to put the first time through, or the second time through rather, we're looping through this American Express statement, which is used for the Salt Lake office. So it's going to be equal to the first position in that office's array that we created. So Salt Lake is going to be put in there. Then Seattle, then Denver, then San Francisco, then Seattle, etc. Great. So that's how we're going to get the offices, in my solution at least, put down. This part gets a tiny bit more complicated. Revenue transactions in this bank statement, remember, each office has a unique identifier. Salt Lake City starts with 836, 572 is San Francisco, etc. So all this does is if the office starts in 836, then we're going to dump into this office column Salt Lake City. If it's equal to 409, then we're going to dump in Denver, etc., etc. So that will get us all the offices. And then finally, we're going to increment the transactions, which means we're going to go to the next transaction and we're going to put in the information for that. So that is going to loop through many times through all these sheets and through all the rows in all those sheets and through all these transactions, and it should dump in the correct information. So I'm just going to click in and run this code, and it's still running, finished, and yep, there we go. So that dumped in all the vendors, the offices, the dates, and the amounts. The dates have different formatting, so it doesn't really matter, but you can go through and you can format it in the same way if you'd like. And then the reason I left the account number and the account name blank is because I find it just easier to use, in this case, an XLOOKUP. So we're going to look up this vendor in, actually, let's just do an array formula for this. We're going to look up all of these vendors in this list, and we're going to return the number. Great. We're going to go ahead and pull this over. And what this is doing is it's looking up these account numbers to put in the appropriate account. So we have all this information cleaned, and in a report that we can then pull out some data. This part was really up to you how much analysis you wanted to do. I didn't save this as a macro enabled workbook, so I'm just gonna not do that. The code's saved here for anyone that needs it. I put in some key statistics here. I was able to find the revenue and all these expenses, operating expenses, and the earnings before interest, tax, and depreciation for Q1. And then if you want to go through and look at these formulas for January, February, and March, I was also able to, from that, get a return on sales and a percentage of revenue, expenses, net income. I just graphed a quick, as of Q1 2022, which office has a negative return on sales. As you can see, San Francisco, just a little bit. And then we can see net income as a percentage of total. These are really fluctuating. So I think that one of the takeaways that the doctor can take is looking through this and seeing how he can somehow make these offices more stable in profit. The problem doesn't look like it's in expenses. It looks like a lot of these, Salt Lake City is about 30 to 34%. San Francisco, its expenses are actually pretty stable, but it looks like a lot of the revenue is fluctuating. So I'd say that's some great takeaways for your dentist. And thanks for tuning in to the solution video, and have a great day.